In Chapter 10, we talked a lot about the information systems development. Now, Chapter Extension 15 talks about one aspect of that, which is project management. And you might be wondering why there are two separate sections on this. Well, because project management although the chapter is titled Systems Development Project Management, in all honesty, project management is not specific to information systems. It can be used and is used in a whole host of different areas, including like marketing, new product development, and operations. Anytime you have something new that you're trying to put together, you're creating a project, and I do this when I do my research, right? In fact, I've done research on project management, but the very act of doing research is a type of project, and it needs to be managed. So this focus is specifically on the management of a project. Okay, so whereas information development and like the systems development life cycle considered all the different components, not just the management component. This is just how do we manage it. So you can think of it as complementary, but there's some specific differences that we want to highlight, and to make it real clear exactly how useful this can be in business. And if nothing else, this chapter extension is applicable again to everybody on a very real basis. In fact, in the College of Business here at ECU, we have a class in, I believe it's supply chain management, that is on project management, right? And so it's not even in our discipline, MIS, although we do have an MIS project management class as well. But the operations guy, like, we need to know how to manage projects, right? So it applies across the board. So what we're going to do today is talk about why is formalized project management necessary? And you'll see there are some similarities to what we talked about previously in systems development. What are the trade-offs in requirements, costs, and time? What are the dimensions of project management? How does a work breakdown structure, so it's a big fancy term, you're going to have to know what that means though, a work breakdown structure, how does it drive project management? We're going to look at what are the biggest challenges for planning systems development projects. What are the biggest challenges in managing a systems development project? What is the single most important task for users on a systems development project? All right, so let's start with the first one. Why is formalized project management necessary? Well, I mean, think about it this way. It's very difficult for one person to keep track of all the different complexities in systems development, or in fact any project, right? So there can be many features and functions that are necessary, sometimes very large complex programs, databases with hundreds of tables, dozens and to hundreds of relationships, and then it can affect all different kinds of business processes with hundreds and thousands of users. We got a huge team of people working together, maybe on different sites, perhaps even internationally. And we try maybe even integrating across different companies. And so it's this incredible, all the difficulties that can be involved in this. As one example, Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, right? They, as far as a large scale project goes, okay, so the IRS employs, 100,000 people or more. In over 1,000 different sites and processes over 200 million tax returns a year. In 1995, it started a project to modernize their information system and how they process tax returns. Today, so, this is 18, 19 years later, and several $1 billion later, the project is still not done. Now, that's not saying they haven't implemented parts of this system, but the entirety of the project is not complete. So, I mean, yes, when you got large projects, they take an extraordinary amount of time and is extremely complex. And that's why you had projects, and another famous, or not, I don't know about famous, infamous example was the Obamacare website for signing people up. Ran into some very major issues when it went live. And why is that? Well, because of all these different things, made it extremely difficult for it to complete the requirements necessary when it was supposed to go live, right? Why is this such a big issue? Well, number one is that there's major trade-offs that must be made between three different things: scope, time, and cost. You can kind of think of it as a scale, a three-way scale. I mean, you've probably seen a two-way scale where, you know, if you put a heavy weight, a heavier weight on one side of the scale, the other side goes up. Well, think of a three-way scale, and you have scope, time, and cost. Now, the problem is, if you want to change, increase one of those or decrease one of those, it means the others are going to tip. So if you want to cut costs, the only way for you to cut costs will be either to add time or decrease scope, right? And so, and the same thing with time. So you want to get something done faster, it's either going to cost more or you're going to have to cut out scope. Now, if you want more scope, you're either going to have to increase time or add cost. And so there's this balancing act, and it's really difficult to get the balance just right? Because we're using, you know, human people with all their idiosyncratic approaches to life and work, and it's extremely difficult, right? So systems development projects require balancing of these, and you can do trade-offs, but only up to a point too. So there's only a limited amount of time. There's only a limited amount of time you can cut until you get what I don't know. You guys should remember the diseconomies of scale from Brooks' law. So after you get to a certain point, you just can't cut anymore because you're going to have to add. The more people you're adding to try to cut time actually adds more complexity, which actually slows it down. All right. Well, let's start with the baseline plan. So project management, a lot of it is about planning. So the baseline plan stipulates that tasks that must be accomplished, the resources that are going to be assigned to the tasks, and the schedule for the completion of each task. All right? So three major things: the activities, the resources to get it done, and the schedule of when they're going to get done. Sounds easy, right? Well, it never ever goes according to this plan. Now, sometimes you're close, and hopefully you can be dead on. But it oftentimes requires trade-offs between requirements, costs, and time. You have cases where critical people leave, sometimes right in the middle of a project. So what can you imagine if you have like a senior programmer, a really top-notch programmer who made these estimates of getting the project done at a specific time based on his skill level, but he leaves. And now a junior programmer has to take over. Well, he's not nearly as talented as perhaps the senior programmer was. And so the original estimates are going to be way off. And so might your plan be. Right? This happens often. Or another example would be an executive who perhaps is in charge of a major stakeholder of the project leaves. Well, then suddenly the resources that you had start drying up because people don't want to keep funding a project that they're not really passionate about. Things can happen like hiring freezes, right? So you might have had these ideas that you were going to hire some, testers to do a certain aspect, some of the testing for your project. But right when you go to hire them, right before you go to hire them, the company decides well, no, the economy is not doing that great right now. We're not going to hire anybody new for the next 6 months. What does that mean for your project, right? So you need to test this, but you can't hire the people you need to test it. And then sometimes you even have natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, floods, right? When those things occur, when those things occur, they can easily throw off your plans. But then you also have competitor actions, and then you have to respond to those competitor actions. And we talked a little bit about technology changes too. The technology may change while you're in the middle of your project, or you can have new management. Okay, so because of these complexities with creating a plan, they've actually developed over many, many years some best practices for project management. And actually today, there's one organization that is kind of known as the gold standard for project management. That's the Project Management Institute. And they have actually developed a knowledge base, and in fact even have a certification in project management. So the Project Management Institute has identified, well, it used to be 9 knowledge areas. They've actually recently added a 10th one. But the dimensions of project management include project integration management. Okay, and this is making sure the project as a whole is integrated together. You need scope management. So again, when we define our requirements and how do you manage the, which is kind of the scope. So the scope is the limits of the requirements. And so if the requirements change, that means your scope changes. But you kind of think of it as like, if you think of a balloon, right? The requirements are all the air inside of it, and the scope is the outside, the rubber of the balloon. And so if you blow more air into the balloon, that means more requirements are going into the balloon. The scope expands, so your balloon expands. You need time management. So especially for things that are mission critical for getting done by a specific time. You know, if you're going to build a factory, you want to make sure that it's completed within a shortest amount of time possible so you can recoup the money that you spent on this as fast as you can. Now the same thing applies for information systems. You're spending a lot of money sometimes to create these information systems. You want to start recouping the benefits as quickly as possible. So getting things done quickly is very important. You got cost management, right? So you remember the 3 balanced areas: scope, time, and cost. Those are 3 of the primary management issues in project management. But then there's also these other various management things, such as quality. So not only knowing what the scope is, but the quality of the output. Human resource management. So staffing is incredibly important. Communications management. Right? And you guys are learning a little bit about this in your collaborative group efforts here for the class assignments. But there are best practices and ways that groups can communicate, including teams working on a project. So a project manager needs to know how to manage that communication effectively. Then there's the risk management. So dealing with different risks. And these aren't just, we've identified some of these risks already. So you're a little familiar with, you know, risks of people leaving the organization, or risks of natural disasters, or risk with, you know, budget constraints. You know, how do you deal with these things? So there's a management techniques for dealing with that. And the 9th one was the procurement management. So how best to buy or acquire the resources necessary for the project. And now this can be tied in, and a lot of these are very integrated together. So, for example, you know, procuring stuff depends a lot upon what's the scope, what types of things do you need, what are the cost. You want to make sure it's of a certain quality, but you also need to make sure there's good communication to make sure you procure the right things. And now the 10th thing that's been added a little bit more recently is something called stakeholder management, which deals with anybody with any vested interest in this project. That can be the users, it can be the executives, it can be the team, specifically the team, the project team, but anybody that may be touching this. Okay, so dealing with all these different stakeholders is another management area. Now, the Project Management Institute, and what they call it is their PMBOK. So PMBOK stands for Project Management Body of Knowledge, and so that's what the PMBOK is, and they're in the center. Actually, now, like I said, it's 10 knowledge areas now. They also identify 5 process groups, which are initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and control, and lastly, closing. And so to give you a little hint at the complexity that can go into this, here's a brief outline of different deliverables. And so a deliverable is something that you deliver at a certain point. And so you can think of the process groups as groups of things that need to be processed that are very similar. So initiating the project, planning the project, executing the project, monitoring and controlling the project, and closing the project are all part of those process groups. Again, back to business processes, right? So there's a lot of different business processes involved in project management. Understanding the entire complexity of this in various different areas, there's deliverables, which are the things that you want to have completed. These are like documents that you have to turn over, like a project, a charter, or a project plan, or a schedule. So in project management, this can actually get fairly complex. Now, you don't want to overdo this complexity on simple projects, and there's ways to scale it down for simpler projects. But where we have the biggest problems are on the biggest projects. And so having good management at this level is absolutely critical to a lot of businesses. In fact, that's why the Project Management Institute has a very highly valued certification in the project management professional. It's called a PMP. Project management professionals, in order even to sit for the exam, you have to be working in project management for at least 5 years. Like they want people who, not just newbies who want to get a quick certification to move up, but someone who actually has really solid knowledge about project management and has experience in project management to have the certification so they can be known as experts in managing projects. Now, one really big part of this scheduling and planning phase is actually developing something called a work breakdown structure. And I want to talk a little bit about this. Essentially, it is a hierarchy of tasks. And each task ends with a deliverable. All right, so a deliverable, again, a deliverable is something you're going to have to deliver to somebody else. And there you have to do some tasks in order to complete that. Now, so let's say a deliverable might be to develop, or I'm sorry, a deliverable might be the project charter. What are the tasks to create the project charter? Might be meet with the steering committee, to do a feasibility analysis and acquire or get commitment from a executive. So I'm just making up some stuff that might go into it, and it's going to depend on the business. But the important point here being that each of these deliverables are going to be associated with different sets of tasks. Now, the PMBOK really wants to focus on deliverables as kind of the key outcome, right? So it's finished things, not just doing tasks, but having something finished at the end. And so these deliverables are documents, designs, prototypes, data models, database designs, working data entry screens. It can be any of these different things, but there's something that's finished and delivered. But the work breakdown structure does even more than that, because it helps you to identify different task dependencies. So in other words, some tasks are dependent upon other things being done. So for example, you can't create a data model until you have a database design. Or wait, it's the other way around. You can't create the database design until you have the data model. And you can't create the actual database until you have a database design. So there's a dependency there. In order to have the working database, you have to have a database design. In order to have a database design, you have to have the data model. And before you can have a data model, you have to have a requirements. And before you have the requirements, you have to identify that you want to do this project. So, you see that there's a series of things that have to be done, one before the next, in order for you to get to the finished product. All right, the work breakdown structure also estimates the task duration, cost, and labor needed. So it's building everything So that whole three-pronged scale of scope, cost, and time, you're going to try to estimate all of those in your work breakdown structure. So it's basically planning the entire project and everything associated with it. Now, most of the time, this can be long and difficult, so you use software. In particular, one of the best ones for project management or creating the project or designing the project is actually Microsoft Project. But you create something oftentimes called a Gantt chart. And the Gantt chart is used to illustrate when which tasks will be done when and which resources need to be ready when. So you can see from this little snapshot here on the bottom that we have various different project names. We have different tasks names and subtasks and sub-subtasks. We have durations for how long things should take, but we also have resource names like who is doing what and how much of that work are they doing. And we see estimates for how long it will take. And so some tasks might be able to be done very quickly within a couple days. Some tasks may take months to complete. So for example, like designing a user interface, which you would think, well, a user interface, that's you just create a screen, right? Well, no, you have to, depending on how precise you want to be with your user interface, it can take months to do it well, especially if it's an iterative feedback loop where people create a design, they get feedback, they make changes, and they continue doing this. And sometimes there's multiple screens, views that they need to be seen, and sometimes you have to change where the order of things are on a page, change the size and font in order to fit more information, or how to make it look consistent from one screen to the next. It can actually be a very complex process. But a Gantt chart of the work breakdown structure for a system will also include things like a critical path. So right here in this screenshot, they show in red are the critical paths to getting the project done. What does that mean? Well, that means the path, the shortest path of things that need to get done in order for you to be finished. Now, some tasks can be done concurrently, at the same time, right? For example, under 1.2, they have a feasibility analysis. They have cost, schedule, technical, and organizational feasibility, and a document feasibility. And you see that each of these are listed on there. Well, one of them is going to take 1 week. The other one should take 2 or 3 days. So which one is going to take the longest? The cost feasibility. So now this becomes part of your critical path because it's going to take the longest. Even though all these are being done at the same time, the one that takes the longest amount of time is the one that has to be complete before you can go on to the next step, which was the management review and the go, no-go decision. Before you can get to that decision, you have to complete the feasibility analysis. And the longest one of those is the cost one. All right. Now, assuming there's a go, then you go to the next step. Now, you'll see that there's a series of things that have to be done. Some of them have to be done before others. Such as example, you need to establish milestones for the project. Now, what's interesting about this work breakdown structure is that sometimes the milestones and create the work breakdown structure, it says we're going to create the work breakdown structure, but you already have some of the work breakdown structure already created. So that's part of the process in and of itself. And sometimes you even go back and say, all right, this is what we have done, just to document it for next time. So the next time you have a project, you have some documentation of what was done and then what you plan to do in the future. Can all be combined into one Gantt chart of the work breakdown structure. So there is a ton of information built in to a Gantt chart. And it captures a lot of the information that plans a project out. Now, again, this is assuming you already have a lot of the details, especially if you're starting to work on like the requirements. Once you have the requirements, you can then do a better job of really estimating how long it will take to design and implement a solution and so on. But before you get there, you can actually use a different type of chart called a PERT chart, used in a lot of the early stages of the plan to determine how long a project may take. Allows you to determine the critical path so you can focus on the most important tasks. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details on this because this is a really huge subject and it can take a long time to really understand project management at a really high level and be able to do good project management. All right, so what are the biggest challenges for planning a large-scale system development project? All right, so there's 4 really. Number 1, how long does it take? Is an extremely difficult thing to estimate. So you can, for example, do we need to develop a large data model and adapt the data model to user satisfaction? Do we have to develop a computer program? How big is the program? Can we buy part of the program to do some of the stuff? What parts won't it accomplish, and do we have to build something to integrate it? How long will it take to build that integrative application? And then if you have problems with scheduling, especially along the critical path. So for example, let's say there's a component that needs to be created before you can do anything else, a component of your program. You estimate 1 week, but it takes 3 weeks. Well, because everything else is dependent upon that, if that one component is late, everything else is going to be late, which creates the snowball effect. Third, you can have a lot of difficulty to do credible planning because of this. And you might find out that every task may be on critical path. So, so even though project planning can offer a lot of help in organizing and understanding a project, it is not a panacea. It's not going to fix everything. Okay, and I think that's important to understand that this helps a lot, but it is not perfect. Okay. So there's 3 major approaches to this challenge. One is to avoid major scheduled risks and license software from vendors. Right? So if you don't build it yourself, it's already pre-created, and you use what's already there. There's also, you can omit the impossibility of systems development scheduling and plan accordingly. Right? And know that when you schedule that things are going to go wrong, and just make adjustments. And this can be considered part of the change management to your scope. So under the scope management, there's a subsection called change management, which is dealing with changes. If you focus on that for systems development, you can oftentimes overcome some of these issues with scheduling. And you can attempt to schedule development project despite these difficulties, which you usually inevitably try to do because you need to know some sort of outline of when things are going to be done. So you can make estimates to people, or tell people, hey, our product's going to release in 6 months, our new version of this product or whatever. So what are some estimation techniques? Well, one is to use past project as a guide. So you can look at a project that's similar in size and scope, and you see how long it took, make estimates based on that. Sometimes people make estimates based on the number of lines of code that need to be written. And again, the number of lines of code that need to be written is sometimes unknown. But you can make educated guesses based upon the complexity that the requirements ask for. Also, you can use industry or company averages to estimate time required. And lastly, you can estimate function points in a program, determine the lines of code, and estimate schedules based on that. So in other words, you say, what are all the different functions that this program is going to do? And so you kind of work backwards. So functional points you can think of as specific tasks or procedures that it's going to help with. Determine the lines of code. There's usually an average for each function, and then estimate schedules based on that. So there's a variety of different ways that this can go about. Still doing fairly decent estimation for software development projects. But what are the biggest challenges for managing a systems development project? Well, number one is coordination of independent groups that might reside in different locations. So back in around 2000, 2001, there was a major effort by a lot of businesses to outsource their software development to India. In fact, we saw, especially in the university, we saw a lot of computer science departments enrollment dropping because students were scared that all the jobs were being outsourced to India. Now, this didn't happen the way everyone figured, because they did run into lots of coordinating issues working with Indian programmers. Now, it's not to say that Indian programmers are bad programmers. They're in fact very, very qualified and very competent and very skilled, especially after what they've had, 14 years of experience working with American companies. And so this has now become much better. However, there's still coordination issues. Now, it doesn't have to be overseas coordination, but a lot of people are using international programmers to do some of their software development, because these people do it at a much reduced price than what a programmer here in the US might charge. We've already talked about diseconomies of scale, whereas adding more people, especially late in a project, actually leads to an exponential growth in the number of interactions between these people, including not just communicating, but coordinating all the different development that needs to be done. So there is a limit to how many people you can add to a project to get it done, depending on the size of the project. Now, if you have a really big project, yes, you're still going to need a lot of people, but it's inevitably going to be much more difficult to manage a project like that. You also have to try to figure out the configuration and control it in terms of management policies, practices, and tools to maintain control over all the resources. So there's a lot of different parts that are kind of floating, and we talked about the three parts balance between scope, cost, and time. Well, you have resources to help configure your project, but this configuration is very difficult to control. Project managers also have to deal with unexpected events that may disrupt the project. And we've talked a little bit about a few of these, including natural disasters or personnel changes or technology changes. So a project manager's job is to deal with these unexpected events. And lastly, and this might be one of the hardest ones of all, is maintaining team morale over time, which is especially difficult for long projects because people do get burnt out. And it requires employees to make sometimes substantial sacrifices, and especially after a project gets behind schedule. And then there might be a big push to get back caught up. Now, if you're a part-time or if you're working as an hourly worker, you might get paid time and a half to come in on the weekend. But if you're a salaried worker, sometimes you're told, well, we're behind, we have to get caught up, you're working this weekend, deal with it. And that does happen, and it has happened to me, so I know that from personal experience that can be a huge drain on maintaining your morale, especially if this happens over a long time. Now, it's easier when it's only like a 3 or 6 month project because you can at least see the ending. But when it's like a 3-year project, It's, after like the first year, the excitement tends to die off, even with major milestones, and you're hitting your milestones, but seeing the end result, it's huge for people to actually feel that personal sense of accomplishment when they finish these things. And if you don't get to that point, it can be very draining. So I've talked a lot about the project manager and their role in this. What I want to talk about next is probably the single most important task for users on a systems development project, which is you need to take responsibility for the requirements. What does that mean? That means the system that's being developed is entirely based upon these requirements. And so if the user does not take responsibility for these and identify as clearly as possible what the requirements are for them to get their job done, not just okay, but done well. If they don't take responsibility for that, the project inevitably is going to fail, in that you're going to end up with some sort of system that doesn't meet your needs. Now, I've played with, and I'm going to give you a quick example on a personal level system that I use. So I'm a big fan of the organizational and time management system called Getting Things Done. And if you ever need some help with organizing your life, I highly recommend it. It's great for both personal and professional life. But I have been trying to find a system that helps me get my things done. So it keeps a list of things that I need to get done, and keeps track of all the stuff that I want to do eventually, the different projects I'm working on. So the system is designed. And when I say the system, this is the entire information system, not just the software that I use. But the entire system is designed to keep me on track and moving forward with all the different stuff I have going on in my life. And sometimes it's easy to get overwhelmed by doing that. So I've tried to use software to help facilitate this process, but I've been struggling with this over the last couple of years, finding the software that helped me do this best. And I'll try something for 6 months, sometimes a year. For a while there, I was using OneNote, but there was a lot of manual processes built into it, and I was starting to get frustrated with it. So lately, I would say the last 2 months, I've tried a new piece of software that I've tried to use to complement OneNote, but I haven't been loving that as well either, because now I have 2 pieces of software instead of 1. So where did I go wrong? Why am I struggling with this? Well, because partly is I have a sense of what some of these requirements are, but I haven't been extremely clear about what exactly I need for it to be successful, and then trying to use the software I have to fit that as well as I can. And so, I had to take responsibility to get the requirements exactly what I want, for me to be as productive as I can be, and not waste time on things that are not important to my life or to my job. So I have to take responsibility for that. Now, this is true on a personal information system as well as a business information system, whether it's in your work group, in your enterprise, or even inter-enterprise, if you remember the different levels of information systems, right? You have to take responsibility for the requirements to make sure that the system supports the business functions, specifically the functions that impact you and your job, but also those of you who you're working with. Because if they get frustrated or can't do their job, then oftentimes you can't do your job. So you want to try to help the organization achieve all of its goals and objectives. Managing requirements is critical to making this a success, which means you can't be passive when it comes to information systems. So one of the reasons why we keep hammering in on all this technology that's out there and available and you could use and possibly use and how to think about it is because we don't want you to be passive and just say, oh yeah, just give me whatever, I'll work with it. Right? No. We want you to be awesome on your job and not just sit back and passively take it in, but to be proactive and say, this is what I can, I want you to be responsible for ensuring complete and accurate requirements, responsible for managing requirement changes and avoiding requirement creep. I want you to define what conditions need to be met for a test to be successful. Right? You need to evaluate different data miles, provide even the test data and the sample scenarios. All of this, you need to step up and become an active participant in information systems development. Yes, you can be passive, and guess what? You're also going to maintain a minimum wage job if you will do, right? You want to be someone successful in life, then take an active role in understanding how this information systems work, how to integrate what you know with the management skills that you're learning, to become very enabled in creating and the decision-making processes to help you do your job better and those who come after you to do their jobs better. All right. So that pretty much covers all the stuff in chapter extension 15 that I wanted to talk about. Real quickly, I wanted to point out, and because this is kind of a new initiative at ECU, we're trying to put together a project management certificate, which is actually a sequence of 4 graduate classes scheduled to begin this spring in 2015. What we want to do is help our students here at ECU, and it should be an online sequence of classes. So after you guys graduate, and it's going to apply not just information systems, but to any degree out there. So if any of you guys, no matter what your degree, you can sign up for this certificate. It can be a great differentiator, especially if you're having troubles finding a job. Take a look at this project management certificate. It will enable you to take so the Project Management Institute, I told you about the PMP certification. They actually have a kind of a junior level certification that is a little bit easier to take. This will prepare you for that. It gives you a lot of good hands-on experience with managing projects, helps you to improve your communication and leadership skills, and develop experience with tools like Microsoft Project. Even if you decide not to, do realize there are other project management certificates out there. I'm of course going to promote ours because we rock, here at ECU, and we love to have you guys come back and continue your education with us, because and this can be true of people that have been out in the industry for many years too. The fact of the matter is, there's millions of project managers out there now. Not all of them are certified, but there are well over 1 million certified project managers. And businesses do demand project management skills. It is something that is sorely needed, and when you have it, you can really help businesses and enable them to really step up their game. Dealing with these complexities of balancing all these different factors in order to create create new business processes, to create better information systems, to create to step up the game of every business and make them successful. So I know, kind of generic there at the end, but you get the idea though. All right. Well, that's all I'm going to talk about for today, and hopefully that'll give you a little bit to think about going forward. So project management is absolutely an essential part of business. It is all about management of multiple different fields, and in systems development, it is a very, very important aspect to the development process, and complements the information systems development, so that SDLC we talked about previously. Well, that's it for today, guys, and I look forward to